afternoon. We're going live today, and I'm inviting Jeremy to join me, and we're going to talk about boundaries. Just give me one moment.
Let's see if that works. Oh, there he is. Great. Hi,
Oh, I'm way
Jeremy.
too close. Hello. Hang on, let me back my camera up a bit.
Sure.
That didn't help a ton, did
It's okay though.
it? Just a real close up of me.
Yeah.
Hello. Thanks for having
Hello.
me on today.
Thanks for being here. It's really nice to meet you.
Yeah,
Where are you located? I don't think I even know that.
I am in Wisconsin. So you
Okay.
are my native to the north. So I'm in Milwaukee,
Yep.
which
Okay.
for people who aren't in the United States is about an hour and a half north of Chicago, which
Okay.
I think is a big enough city that people recognize. But yeah, I'm in Wisconsin,
Yeah.
so I do telehealth across the state, and then I practice in Milwaukee. So I
Okay.
do both in person and telehealth.
Okay. Great. Do you see a certain type of client? Do you specialize? Have a niche?
Sure, I have too many niches, is what I'm told by marketing best practices.
Oh
I'm a
yeah.
licensed marriage and family therapist. So my bread and butter is couples therapy. That's what I do. That's the majority of my caseload, and that's what I've done since I started doing therapy. Back in the day. I also have a background in sports psychology, so I was a college athlete myself and a college coach, and worked with a lot of college level athletes. And then I recently have added religious trauma. Last year, I added a religious trauma certification. So that's the
Okay.
new niche.
Wow. What brought you to add that?
I think going through my own deconversion during COVID and not having, I found a lot of resources after I deconverted, but not while I was going through it. And so I think looking for therapists in my area and not finding a ton, using like sites like the Secular Therapy Project, and there not being therapists in my state. So I think it was
Yeah.
the thing where I had that personal experience, and then professionally, I was like, oh, like this is a difficult thing that people go through and there aren't a ton of resources. So I kind of built my community after the fact, but it was one of those things where I felt going through the experience that like this would be helpful for people ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and experiencing that yourself and then seeing the holes and, finding those resources and those directories where there isn't anything represented of what you needed and then being able to fill that. That's amazing.
Yeah, and I'm in like I don't know, the Bible Belt southern from where we're at, but I'm in a heavy like evangelical area
Okay.
geographically. So I also
Okay.
felt like for people who are getting out of a high control religion, that there's definitely space here for people who are going to need those resources.
Great. Yeah. Cool. So today, Jeremy and I are going to be talking about boundaries and specifically when it comes to our deconstructions. And we've both, through our own experiences in our own personal lives, I'm sure you've gone through sorting out boundaries. I know that I have, as I've worked through my own upbringing, my own path. But then also, we both work with clients who are always talking about boundaries and the challenges, and specifically when it comes to religious trauma and deconstruction. So that's what we're going to explore today. So Jeremy, to start off, do you want to just talk a little bit about what boundaries are and why they are important?
Sure. So boundaries are kind of the parameters that we all have for where our behaviors are healthy for us. And I think around the topic of deconstruction, it's a thing that a lot of religions don't teach or teach bad boundaries even. And so going through the deconstruction process, I think is tough because not only do you not know what your boundaries look like when they're healthy, but a lot of times you've only been taught what unhealthy boundaries look like. So boundaries kind of keep you in that range where you can be functional, you can be happy and healthy and find joy in your life. And having poor boundaries is kind of either, taking on too many things or taking on other people's emotional baggage or putting other people's needs before your own. Those are all kind of like common threads I see and I think for everyone, not just people dealing with religious trauma or adverse religious experiences, but I think a lot of people struggle with boundaries. I believe you're an MFT as well, so like doing couples or families work, there's boundaries work to be done across the board. But I think a lot of people are starting off almost like a step behind because they didn't get that boundary work growing up. They were taught either bad information or just weren't taught how to do boundaries.
Right. So what themes do you see come up specifically around what boundaries are or what they aren't, or the existence of boundaries, or whether boundaries are even okay to have as people?
Yeah, I think the most common one I definitely see is people pleasing. Just putting other people's needs above your own and not really knowing even that that's unhealthy. I work with a lot of people where kind of they have this guilt around putting themselves first, or they don't know how to invest in themselves because they're so used to putting other people first, and they don't just like to put themselves first is this crazy kind of radical idea of like, but isn't that selfish? And I shouldn't be selfish. So I think there's a lot of people pleasing that comes along with it, and that kind of branches out then into other things such as like being trying to be responsible for other people's emotions. I see that a lot in the couples work that I do, where well, if I don't do this, then my partner's mad at me, or if I don't do enough of these good things, then my partner's going to be upset, and not being able to realize that like we can't control other people, just control yourself. So the people pleasing is definitely the one I see the most, and then there are kind of these themes of like enmeshment or not having any boundaries at all, where it's like really just people are ingrained in each other's lives and taking on a lot of drama or stress from other people.
Yeah. Do you think that religion or certain types of religions kind of breed that type of enmeshment and even maybe spiritualize it? That it's not just what happens,
Yeah.
but it's actually a good
Um,
thing to kind of be like that?
yeah. So I have a couple educators in my family, and I spent a couple years in higher ed and at religious institutions. And there's this idea of like being
Mhm.
service minded, and how that becomes like that's good and godly to put other people in front of yourself. And so maybe that means you're not getting paid appropriately. Maybe that means you're doing more jobs than are in your job description. So like I've seen it firsthand in a lot of unhealthy work environments where like it's probably illegal and then also just like shady, I would say, as far as business practices go. But it becomes this thing of like, well, that's good to give more of yourself, and you'll be rewarded in heaven by giving more. And if you stay late even though you're not getting paid for it, or you're working these crazy hours even though you're not being compensated appropriately, like your reward is a nicer mansion in heaven. So like, yeah, I definitely think there are religions. I'm familiar with evangelical. It's a big community in the area, and that's what I was raised. But I also think some of the fundamentalist religions and some of kind of the more charismatic religions that are looking for like signs and wonders and active stuff, a lot of those core boundaries are built in. Like they're not a flaw, they're a feature of the religion. And so you have these people who I think maybe are in need or have bad boundaries to begin with, and they get swept up in kind of that like positive feedback they get from the church of like giving and
Mm.
giving and giving. And then they're surprised, or they're concerned that God's forsaken them or whatever when they're burnt out. But like most people would have been able to see that coming from miles away. Of like, of
Right.
course you're gonna burn. You keep giving and giving and giving and never recharging. Like that's
Yeah.
unsustainable.
So sometimes burnout can be seen as a lack of faith. That it's just a sign that you need to really dig in, and like
Right. And
maybe
like
even add things to your plate, like more services or more volunteer opportunities. Um, but it's burnout. It's what the body does when you overwork.
right. And this idea like when something goes wrong, there needs to be a spiritual meaning. So like, is it something you did? Did you do something wrong and you're being punished and this is a consequence? Is it a trial? Do you need to like power through? Do you need to just pray more or trust more? And I think like after you kind of deconstruct some of that, like it feels really gross to see it. Like, no, like let's grieve with this person. Let's support them as they're going through something hard, like not trying to have them figure out what they did wrong that went bad in their life. So I think, that's another thing that I think is baked into the core boundaries in some religions is like God is the source of all things that are good and wonderful, and
Mhm.
anything that goes bad in your life is your fault. And
Right.
so it's like you don't get to celebrate or take credit for anything that's going well or celebrate your
Mhm.
strengths or even discover what your strengths are. You
Yeah.
spend all this time with guilt and shame. And so that's definitely another theme I see with a lot of people. I was raised evangelical Lutheran. So definitely with Lutherans, I see a lot with Catholics too. Catholics will joke about that
Mhm.
Catholic guilt they grow up with. And I think that's just built in where like, right, you don't get the good, positive regard, you get all the bad, your fault, this is your
Right.
consequence, this is your cross to bear, your trial and tribulation.
Right. Yeah. How does that show up in the counseling office?
Usually people don't know about, I don't know about your
Yeah.
caseload, but sometimes clients who come in and are dealing with religious trauma, they don't often come through the door like saying, "Hey, hello, nice to meet you. I have religious trauma." It's a
No.
thing that we kind of unpack and discover
Hmm.
together.
Yeah.
They've maybe like left the faith or they've switched a couple churches and they don't feel like their
Mhm.
community's the same or they're feeling outcast or they're feeling pressure or they're doubting, but they're usually not aware that like, hey, this is trauma, and they have no concept for the most part of like what healthy boundaries should look like, so they don't know that their boundaries are being disrespected or pushed back on. So I think a lot of times it's like figuring out that like, oh, like some of the symptoms you're experiencing, maybe of burnout or of anxiety or perfectionism, or all these unhealthy relationships, interpersonal relationships you have, like those are symptoms of a larger issue here, and that has to do with boundaries. And so I think a lot of times it's kind of introducing the concept and connecting the dots of like, okay, these are not like mysterious things that are happening in your life. They're happening for a reason because you're letting too many people in your life who aren't helpful to you or aren't healthy to have in your life.
Right. I always find it so exciting when you go through that process with a client of exploring what boundaries are and why they matter, and then that sense of like, oh my goodness, I can't possibly set these boundaries because everything will fall apart. Um, and then inching towards starting to set boundaries, and then them actually found over time finding the empowerment in themselves as they make choices that are good for them, and then
Yeah.
over time the response of other people starts to matter less because they're starting to find what they need internally instead of from the affirmation of other people for doing all these things that they're supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah. And I think it's it's never it's rarely linear. It's a lot of like starts and stops. And that first
Yeah.
time they set a boundary and it goes well, like they're ecstatic. Like I did it, I figured it
Hmm.
out. I said no to something that I would
Hmm.
normally say yes to. I feel so much happier and
Hmm.
healthier. I got enough sleep or whatever it was that they said no to, and it feels great. And then like they get some momentum, and then maybe a close friend who's still religious or a family member or somebody who's a little bit more enmeshed in their life comes along, and that's a much more tricky boundary to set and enforce, and then that starts to feel less good. So I think it's a lot of like starts and stops with,
Oh,
and not full stops, but like it's a lot of big leaps forward in making progress and then like kind of trudging for a while through that
yeah.
next step of progress. But yeah, when people kind of get to a point where they know what their boundaries are and they have a pretty good idea of how to enforce them, it's this
Hmm.
wonderful experience to see kind of the difference from when they came in and people pleasing or having a lot of guilt and shame to being like, this is what I do to be happy and healthy, and I know how to
Right.
do that now.
Yeah, totally. Um, would you say that there is usually a working out of the relationships that change due to the boundaries being set?
Yeah, for sure. The language I always use is the weeding out process.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm a terrible gardener. We have a nice garden in our backyard, and my wife successfully grows things, and I don't. But I use a lot of gardening metaphors, and so we talk about like weeding out some of these relationships. People who aren't interested in respecting your boundaries or aren't interested in you even
Mhm.
having boundaries, not being healthy. Like those relationships aren't sustainable, and so they're weeds, and they come back and they pop up in unexpected ways. But we kind of just like pluck them out and re set our boundaries and enforce our boundaries again, and we grow healthier relationships. Then once we get the weeds out, the things that we nurture and are healthy and are going well, those are the relationships that we nurture and we give our attention to. But a lot of times, our garden, when we don't have boundaries, our garden gets overgrown. And so there's a lot of weeding up front. And that feels really unpleasant. Like
Yeah.
clients typically don't feel like that part of it is successful because they feel like they're losing friends or they're losing family or these people that they care about are turning their backs on them. And it feels
Hmm.
bad. And so it's hard to see that kind of as progress. So I do a lot
Yeah.
of work in trying to set those expectations ahead of time. Like this isn't going to be fun all the time, but where we land and once we get to a point where we're healthy, like it's going to feel so much better, and it will be very little, if any, work once we have those negative relationships kind of sequestered where they should be in an appropriate place, and we have those healthy relationships really growing and kind of self-sustaining. That becomes this really freeing process for people.
Yeah. A theme I find often, especially clients coming from an evangelical background, which is also my background,
Mm-hmm.
is a belief that they have to be in good relationship with everyone in their life, and that if they're not, they've done something wrong and something is terrible in their life. So like it's on them to be in a good relationship. So that can be a big barrier to setting boundaries because it's going to change relationships. And there's often that sense of feeling, uh, what's the word? Feeling bad, like feeling like you're a bad person for doing this.
Mm-hmm.
But just like weeding a garden, sure, you're pulling weeds out of the ground that are growing. Those are plants, right? But they're not actually serving the greater purpose of that garden. And so it's really paring down like what are your priorities and what in what ways are you giving to that garden, but also what ways do you need to receive from that garden in order to be able to give? And that,
Right.
like that, it goes both ways, right? And I think
Yeah.
some religious iterations, there's this, it only goes one way. We just give and give and give, and we shouldn't need to take anything. We should
Right.
get everything we need from God or from the higher power.
Yeah. As long as
So
our
that's a
faith
process to
is
get there.
yeah. As long as our faith is strong enough, or we're doing enough,
Yeah.
good works, and we're giving enough of ourselves, and we don't doubt ever, then we get. But like that falls flat for most people, and I think the people
Hmm.
who are successful in religious groups are privileged. Like there's stereotypes about pastors' wives and pastors' kids, like kind of being these privileged people. And I think that's what it is. I think it's privilege. I think if you're you're within that in group in the religion and you're part of the majority in group, like right, that seems easy and that seems nice, but it's privilege. And so that's where we see a lot of marginalized groups. We see people of color. We see LGBTQ people. Like those are the groups that have been had the least amount of space to be healthy within a religious context because they're not fitting that in group, that overall arching theme. So like my background working in athletics, I worked with a ton of kids who were LGBTQ who played sports and were at this Christian college for the sport that they played, but like did not fit in with the culture of
Hmm.
conservative Christianity. And it was like this weird, a lot of pressure on their identity to kind of keep that side of themselves hidden because they just didn't want to deal with the social stigma or the professors saying hurtful things or traumatizing them. So it was I even when I was still identified as a Christian, like I was already in working with people who were from marginalized backgrounds and felt like they didn't fit in. Um, and so I was always kind of like that liberal, safe space person, even
Hmm.
when I was working in a Christian setting and identified that way. So I think kind of when you see those patterns, it becomes hard to um, stick with it without going through some significant change. Like for me, that was total deconversion. And I know people use the word deconstruction. I felt like it was really deconverting, just like people kind of
Hmm.
have that religious experience of coming to church and finding their space. Like for me, it was like stepping away from that and
Hmm.
feeling like, oh, this is whole, like this is me, the whole person. This is healthy. I'm congruent with
Hmm.
my scientific background, my psychology brain, and all that stuff, and my morals and ethics. Like I'm not having to explain anything away or juggle anything. So I had that experience. So I tend to use the word deconversion
Hmm.
because I think it fits with my experience. But it's a process, whether it's deconstruction or whatever. Like it's not you just decide one day, like, oh, guess I don't believe this
No,
anymore.
no. Sometimes you don't
So
even
I think,
realize that you're in it until
yeah,
you look back and then you see all of these different conversations or experiences that you've had that have over time informed this like really gradual shift.
yeah. And some people I think have, in the case of severe abuse, I think it's very obvious, and I think those people have like a clear cut, this is when the church stopped being safe for me. But I think for
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people, it is gradual. I joke like I've been deconverting for 20 years now until I finally
Mm-hmm.
was at a point where I could successfully step away completely. But I
Yeah.
think, a lot of times it's if you're raised in it, it's different than if you've come to it later and converted. I think a lot of times there's so many variables that come into it, how much control and authority is in the religious group that you were a part of, um, what your gender is. In the religion I was raised, women don't get to vote on church issues. They don't get to, so like there are all these things that I think it takes different people different amounts of time, and you need to be in a healthy enough and supported enough place where you can kind of explore something different. Otherwise, it's just too unsafe.
Yeah. Yeah. So for you in your own deconversion process, what role did boundaries and the discovery of boundaries play for you?
I mean, I have a little bit of a cop out, and I don't. I deconverted, officially, technically, fully, however you want to word it, during the pandemic, and so um,
Mhm.
once churches weren't open, it was like that was the space I needed to kind of breathe and be like, I I don't want to go back to church. I haven't wanted to go to church since I was a little kid. Like that's not a space that I enjoy or feels good for me. But that gave me time to like look into and kind of deconstruct some of those things. I did a lot of like reading. Richard Carrier's work was really informative to me because I had been taught a version of the Bible that wasn't historically accurate, but I was taught it was the Word of God, so I couldn't question it. So like there was a lot of unpackaging in those things, and for me, COVID, not that COVID was an overall good thing, but it did a lot of the heavy lifting where like there was no church attendance. I wasn't required to show up. I didn't have people seeing me go through that process. And I think because I had a lot of that guilt and shame ingrained where I felt like I would be letting people down by deconverting. It was COVID kind of provided me that space where I'd be like, well, that's okay though. Like that's not up to me to control. And it's so weird because when you're a therapist, you do this work with other people constantly. And then you are like, oh yeah, duh. Like I had this huge blind spot in my own personal life. Um,
Mhm.
but there are still people I haven't told specifically because it's a thing where I'm not either I don't know. I don't think I'm willing to do the work with everybody yet. And there are people who I'm not close enough where I don't feel like that conversation is warranted. So boundaries aren't, it's not like a checkbox you get to check and just be done with it. It's an ongoing process. And I think it depends a lot on what kind of support you have and what kind of community you have around you for how safe and comfortable you are setting certain boundaries. Sometimes keeping certain relationships with family or close friends or maybe an employer or whatever it is, sometimes having different boundaries with different people serves a certain purpose.
Totally.
So it's definitely ongoing
Yeah.
work. It's a thing that I don't feel super settled with, but
Mhm.
it's at a point where I know why I'm doing it and it's intentional. So that part of it at least feels good. I'm very open and genuine in my work, but even in my as a therapist, you have all this confidentiality and stuff. So my work and personal life has been somewhat separated anyways.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Yeah.
there's some family members who I've not sat down and talked to about it because I don't foresee it going well. So it's interesting, and I think that's part of the experience that I didn't see a ton of literature on after I deconverted. I saw a lot of like militant atheists who were like, let's go deconvert everybody, and I saw a lot of people who like were 2, 3 years out in their deconversion and had gone through this experience and talked about how messy it was, but like they weren't in it anymore, so it wasn't an issue anymore. So I think for me, it's been helpful to kind of have that experience and talk to clients about like, right, some of this stuff is messy and it's not clear cut, and we can't always just
Mhm.
this is a healthy boundary and we get to set it 100% of the time and like it'll go great. Like it doesn't always work that way.
Right. Yeah. And you bring up a really good point that it's not the same boundary for everyone, and that what you're describing with the way you choose like to talk through it with one person, but you might not choose that with another person. Those are boundaries that you set, and how important to give ourselves permission to have different levels of energy that we're willing to give or time that we're willing to spend um, in different relationships. Because I've seen people who especially come from evangelical backgrounds, there's that oversharing tendency. Like I've left this way of thinking and now I have to announce to everyone that now I have this way of thinking, and you kind of become an evangelist of the new way of thinking, um,
Right.
with the lack of boundaries towards yourself, towards other people as well. And so it's it's so interesting how the process of deconstruction also goes with the belief itself and like the way that we live out that belief. So some people can just leave that belief and then join another belief, whether secularism or atheism,
Hmm.
but not actually deconstruct the belief itself that they left. So then they just go about that belief in the exact same way, without the boundaries, just like in the other belief. So I think that boundaries are a really important aspect of any deconstruction process, to keep the person less likely to just join another bandwagon, potentially equally fundamentalist as the one that they left.
Yeah, well, and that happens sometimes. There's research that suggests sometimes people leave a religion and they go to something that's almost even more high control. And I think
Hmm.
um, I used to work at a low-fee clinic back in the day before everyone had health insurance, and it was a requirement where some really high-need people would work, and we'd have people who were schizophrenic or bipolar but unmedicated, and so we had some high needs people, and a lot of times the space within our society that took them in was a religious institution. So something like Jehovah's Witness has all these rules, and if you're dealing with a psychotic break, those rules are really helpful in that moment, and that can provide some stability. But over time, when you're not in that high need, those rules become way too rigid, and so it's not sustainable. But I do think a lot of times when people leave one religion and join a different one, and it might even be less healthy for them, it's because they're in that high need when they leave a religion, and sometimes for some people, religion still fills that need then. Um, but it's interesting. I'm circling back a little bit. One of the things you mentioned with boundaries too reminded me of like boundaries are emotional, boundaries are physical, boundaries are mental, boundaries are around your energy. There are all these different boundaries. It's I think sometimes people use the word boundary and it just sounds like nice and easy and like I set a boundary and then this happened. It's like right, but not everybody's going to respect your boundaries. And sometimes that means we have to set boundaries. Sometimes our boundaries need to be about our own personal behaviors because like you said, a lot of those habits are ingrained. So even though we don't believe or ascribe to a certain belief system anymore, our habits might not have changed that much. And so I think that I love kind of the language around deconversion and deconstruction because it is so process oriented. It's not
Hmm.
like you not going to church and that's it.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes boundaries are things that you state to someone, and sometimes
Hmm.
it's a mindset that you hold, and you live it out without necessarily announcing it to other people. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Something I was thinking
And
of, and I'm oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's freeing when you become aware of that and have better
Hmm.
grasp of how to handle some of that because one of the things that I don't know if it's my religious background or it's my Midwest growing up in the Midwest, but if I say no to something, I always feel like I have to give a reason, and it's just one of those
Hmm.
things like joke about being Midwest nice. Like I still to this day struggle with saying like no, I'm not going to do that and just leaving it, or like no, I'm not available without giving an
Hmm.
explanation as to and so I think
Right.
a lot of
Or
times we become aware of that and learn how to handle that better. And like you don't owe that person an explanation.
Mm-hmm.
You don't owe anyone anything. Like, you can just control yourself, so take care of yourself
Mm-hmm.
first. Like, it's this, like, all these doors open, and it feels uncomfortable at first, but once you kind of get a handle on it, it's so freeing. Like, the language I use is, it's so.
Oh, I think I just lost you. Oh, there you are. I lost you for a moment. Yeah.
Sorry.
All right, no problem. Yeah, you were just saying that I'm so freeing to be able to step into those spaces where you can say no. Yeah.
Right.
I remember the first time that I just said no thank you to a telemarketer and then hung up.
Mm-hmm.
And because previous to that, I'd be like, I need to it's on me, even though they're like really inconvenient and I'm not interested at all. I still need to, listen to them and blah blah blah. And now, like, I still have a mandate to be respectful, but I can also say no, thank you. Have a good day, click, right? And
Yeah.
that's some seemingly a small thing, but it's really empowering to realize that I could just say no thanks and walk away or do whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and like, I'm reminded of kind of the biblical teaching of, like, you don't want to cause offense, and like,
Yeah.
that's so wild to me. Like, how do you know what's going to cause offense to one person or another person? So, like, I grew
Hmm.
up, and to this day I have a brother who's 8 years older than me. I'm in my mid 30s. Like, we won't have certain music on if our mom's around because she doesn't like swear words. Like, and so, kind of what you said, like, I think there's a difference between being respectful, and you can still do that
Hmm.
without having to, like, spend a bunch of time and mental energy trying to figure out what might offend someone, and make sure you don't do that because their potential hypothetical needs are more important than your own. Like, right. I
Hmm.
think that's so damaging for
Right.
people that internalize that.
Yeah. Yeah. That it's on them. How much
Right.
stress if other people's emotions are on you? Yeah.
Right.
So,
And I do couples therapy all the time, and I tell people, like, you can't mind read. Like, your partner can't mind read.
no.
You can't read their minds. Like, we're
Hmm.
not using telepathy.
Right.
So, like, yeah,
Hmm.
it's such a weird principle
Yeah.
to be like, well, don't
Yeah.
mind people. Okay,
Yeah.
I can't read their minds,
Also,
so I'm not going to speak about
yeah,
that.
I think when we take other people's emotions onto ourselves, we're also taking away their ability to learn to work through their own emotions,
Yeah, right.
right? So we're taking it upon ourselves and saying, I'm not going to allow you to experience a normal human things. Um,
Right.
so let's all not be human. But what if we just allow ourselves to be human and allow other people around us to be human? So you, out of respect for your mom, don't listen to certain music while she's around. But one song slips in there and there's an F bomb and she's offended. Um, she's an adult, right? And she's a human as
Right.
well, right? With
Well,
the uh, with the human reality of having to work through these emotions.
right. Well, and you talked about autonomy, and I think there's all this talk about free will around religion, but it's not a thing that's encouraged. And so
Yeah,
it's people struggle with, like, right, that's a normal human experience. It's a normal human response. I need to take care of my own stuff. That's my autonomy. And I also can respect and allow people their own autonomy instead of having to try and figure it all out myself, or guess at their needs, or, magically land on what makes everybody happy. So I think it's not
right.
only respecting your own, but also it's more respectful to give other people those opportunities. Like, they can speak up for themselves. That might be a good thing for them to do. They can set their own boundaries. They are allowed to do that, just like you should set your own boundaries. So, like, it's this
Right.
this back and forth, instead of kind of this collective, like, mindset of, like, everybody needs to act this way, and then everything will be perfect if we all just follow these rules perfectly. So I think it allows
Invest.
for a much more genuine experience.
Right. It also seems like it would be anti-codependent. So setting everyone up to not be within codependent relationships with one another. And um, how beautiful if everyone would just do their own work, right? Take
Yeah,
responsibility for themselves.
yeah. Well, and that dependency thing, is we so much is in religion is geared towards your higher power, like whether it's God or whatever version of God it is. It's this idea of like, cast all your cares on him, or it's, pray, you got to have faith, like whatever it is. There is this dependency that's built in that like you can't do it on your own, and like if you're
Mhm.
successful and you're proud of yourself, well, that's pride, and pride comes before the fall. So like it's so hard to build up your own strength and to feel confident in what you're good
Mhm.
at and what you know and what your skills are, to have that sense of autonomy, because those things are undermined constantly to keep that dependence on the church or the higher power that that church ascribes to. And that's where I think abuse is so baked into the structure of religion, like the patriarchal
Mhm.
hierarchies that are there. Like there's
Mhm.
no accountability. It's just move a priest to a different congregation. That pastor gets a job offer somewhere else. Like, there's no accountability in these things, because that's not the point. The point is that people are dependent on the church, and the church gets to kind of do what it wants.
Yeah. Both of
Now I'm
us
still
are. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, now I'm going off on my soapboxes a little bit.
No, I fully agree. And to add to that, like with both of us being marriage and family therapists, we're very systems oriented. So, do you think that the system of religion is dependent on lack of boundaries and codependency and enmeshment in order to function? At least, like, more fundamentalist type religions.
Yeah, definitely with the fundamentalists, the high control religions, um, of which, a lot of the recognized kind of normalized religions are. There are some very loose parameters even around like non-denominational churches, but sometimes you have those cult of personalities that grow out of those churches. That maybe not that they have rules, but they have this one youth pastor who brings in all these people and gets this outsized amount of power within the church. Or you don't have a good board. There's no board of directors, or there's no there's never an HR. So not that I bring it up, but like there's little accountability. So even in the churches that don't have a ton of enmeshment, I think then it can go so far that like there aren't enough. The boundaries aren't rigid, but there are no boundaries. So now like it's great for a couple of years, but after somebody does really well or somebody new comes in or whatever happens, like it's still easy for abuse to take place. It's still easy for these power differentials that are really unhealthy to grow, because the structure, I think, is built on unequal power. It's not ever about equity. It's not ever about um, people being on the same playing field. So
Hmm.
I tend to be of the opinion that like religion is harmful, like full stop. At this point in my life, I might change that. That's not where I've always been, but I think certainly it's obvious in evangelical religions. It's obvious in cults. It's obvious in fundamentalist extremist views. But I think so much of it is still dependent on like people not putting themselves first, not taking care of what they actually have control over. There's still this idea of like giving up, giving in, giving something to some higher power, and I don't think that's sustainable for people.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think it's systemically built in. I think a lot of it is, if you look at it through the lens that we do, like of a healthy family, like it's not healthy. There might be a church here or there that has good boundaries, but I think on the whole, like the structure is based on bad boundaries.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, do you do you do you have any advice for those who are recognizing the lack of boundaries within the religious community and wanting to do it differently for themselves? Or maybe
Yeah,
looking back at the way they were socialized or raised, like whether they're still in the religious community or not. But what advice would you give them, or how would you work with them within a therapy context?
Yeah, well, first, which is implied in your question, but like go to therapy. It's so hard to recognize some of these patterns when you don't have other people who either know what they're looking for or are trying to help you. So even if it's not therapy, even if it's friends or families, if they grew up in the same religion or they're coming from the same background, like they're not going to be able to catch it. They're not going to be able to see the unhealthy patterns as they're happening. So I think finding that support, whether it's therapy, which I obviously encourage, um, or finding support from somebody else who's like, okay, you're people pleasing. Like that's a phrase that's out in culture enough now where people know what that looks like. So I think it's building your support system, having a sounding board of people that you can trust, and when someone's bad at boundaries, I'm a little skeptical that they're going to be able to find someone they can trust right away. They might be too trusting, or they might not be trusting enough, or they might be trusting the wrong people. That's kind of what the boundaries work is about. But I think it's you need that support because a lot of times these
Mm-hmm.
patterns are ingrained, they're almost instinctual, and so it's not often like a cognitive thought process we can track. It's more an instinctual pattern. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction. And so I think having somebody who knows what they're looking for, who can kind of help you work through it is super helpful. So yeah, start with therapy. And then I think when I'm working with people, it's a lot of times connecting your own personal behaviors to the outcomes, to the symptoms. And so it's not a eternal being working in mysterious ways. It's that you're giving too much of yourself and you're burnt out, or this person is oversharing, or this person is expecting unrealistic things from you. And so,
Mm-hmm.
like, that's causing this stress or this cognitive dissonance in your life. And so, it's working with people to kind of connect and see the patterns as they're happening in real time. Oftentimes, people can see the symptoms, they just haven't worked
Mm-hmm.
backwards to kind of connect where those symptoms are coming from and then
Yeah.
what they can do about it. And that's really empowering work to be able to go, right, I get to
Yeah.
set that boundary.
Sometimes,
Right.
yeah, I like that concept of working backwards and looking at where those symptoms are coming from. And sometimes identifying what those are in itself can be so empowering. So to come to the place where you can say, I'm not getting paid enough for doing the work that I'm doing, you know, or of really laying out, how many hours a week are you actually working for your job,
Right.
for your, 40-hour week? Are you doing like 65 hours for 40 hours, or like what are you actually giving, and what is the payback, and taking away all of that spiritual language that sometimes bypasses the actual reality of what your life is.
Yeah, and I think I do a lot of work with cognitive dissonance and like kind of how our
Mm-hmm.
brain is this amazing supercomputer but also is really lazy. And so I'll talk
Yeah.
about like all the shortcuts our brain takes, and spiritual bypassing is a phrase that people will see once they kind of get into the deconstruction work, where a lot of times there's dissonance. We feel unease around something. Our brain kind of like, hang on, that doesn't make sense. And then we're
Mm-hmm.
just kind of taught or indoctrinated into being like, oh, but like I can think of this Bible verse, so like I'll just do that instead. Or,
Yes.
an unexpected loss, and everybody, chimes in on social media with thoughts and prayers, being like, well,
Mm-hmm.
but there's action to be taken around this thing, and
Mm-hmm.
we're skipping that step because we did what we needed to feel okay spiritually, but that's not connected. So I think once people start to like, and this is hard work, right? It's uncomfortable to identify your own kind of biases and figure out like where the dissonance is coming from. Sit with it for a minute to really
Yeah.
look at it. It's like this ugly thing you've kept on a shelf, and now you have to stare at it for a while. And I think, and then identify like, right, that this is a pattern, and what am I doing about it? I see it a lot
Mm-hmm.
with in family therapy, which I do less of now than I used to. But when I was working with a lot of teens who first came out to their religious parents, and like there's all this dissonance because these parents love their kids, they care about them very much, but they have this religion that's teaching them something else. And a lot of them they leave religion at that point, or they kind of like have this push and pull of like, well, it'd be great like if this person would come to church with us, but like I understand that they don't. It's like, right, but like you don't ascribe to that belief anymore then, so why are you still going to that church?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
But again, like that's not, I don't approach it from like a shameful. I spent a lot of years in that, making excuses or having that push and pull of like, well, I don't totally like this about my church, or I don't agree with this, that my church does this, but I'm still going to show up every Sunday. Um, so acknowledging that that's really hard, uncomfortable work. But again, once you get there and you do the work, like it feels so much better to be at a point where you're like, right, I don't like that, so I'm not associated with it. I don't like that there are people protesting soldiers' funerals, so like I'm not going to be associated with that. Like I don't get lumped in that anymore. So I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of freedom, and I use the phrase congruence, where like you feel much
Yeah.
more congruent
I love
with
that
what
word.
your own personal ethics and beliefs are, and your actions are all aligned, instead of having to kind of do some mental gymnastics to make it all make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Letting go of mental gymnastics can be terrifying, but also so freeing at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so energy producing, like I think
Mm-hmm.
people who are dealing with
Right.
cognitive dissonance
Is that true?
or are storing it but not dealing with it, like aren't
Mm-hmm.
aware of how much energy it takes. I talk about passive stressors with people a lot. Like you're not losing sleep over this, but like your body is having to deal with it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's taking up resources both physically and mentally, and probably emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
So tackling some of those dissonance, those cognitive dissonances we have in our brain, and learning how like there's a better way to do it, I think helps people. Like they feel healthier, they feel more energetic, they feel like, oh, I can
Mm-hmm.
get into a good routine, or I have time to tackle a new project, or I have this like
Mm-hmm.
newfound energy because I'm setting better boundaries and I'm not carrying all this like baggage that is heavy.
Yeah. If I want to think about this, I can. If I want to go to this, I can. But along with that comes the option of not.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great thoughts. Thanks so much for sharing. Anything else
Yeah.
that is on your
Um,
mind around these topics?
I think for me, I try and really plug like the secular therapy project. I think
Hmm.
I hope there are more secular therapists out there than are just on the project, and not everybody's listed on there. But like in certain areas, I know it's really hard. In Wisconsin, it's there are two liberal parts of the state with Madison and Milwaukee, and the rest of it's pretty conservative and rural. So like there are parts of the state where people can't find a provider who's going to come at it from a secular place or help them work through it, or aren't informed in a non-Christian place. They still hear horror stories of clients who go start therapy, and their therapist starts off with a prayer or tells them like, you'll be okay, just start going to church. So I think it's one of those things where like finding a resource like that, the Secular Therapy Project, is a great way to find someone who's going to align more with your belief systems, and be informed in a way that's helpful. Um, so I think that's really big. I talk about Freedom from Religion has a great resources page. So like if you're asking questions, maybe you haven't left religion, maybe you don't want to leave religion, and that's really scary for you. But like asking questions is healthy. Like our brain's wired for that. That's good for us. That's not a thing that should be bad or shunned. Like these are good, healthy things to wrestle with. And so I think like tapping into those resources, again, it's a thing I found after the fact a lot. So there are resources out there. Secular Therapy Project is great, and Freedom from Religion has a great resources page that just is like topics and topics and journal articles
Yeah,
and YouTube
there's
videos and
so much.
podcasts. However
Yeah.
you take in information, they probably have information that's useful for you. So I highly recommend those things. Obviously, I'm like, yeah, come see me. I'm taking clients, but but also I think like for a wider audience, there's so much good stuff out there.
Right. Yeah. Also, for religious trauma informed therapists would be the Reclamation Collective Directory.
Yep.
And they've recently
I think
expanded
there.
that as well.
Yes, I think that's up and running again. For a minute, it was down. They revamped their website. So,
Yeah. Yeah. They're doing a little bit of a different thing now. But yeah, there's still a directory. It might be in between things right now. Yeah.
yeah, because I know I'm not listed. I know I'm in like a holding pattern with it. Is the only reason I know that off the
Okay.
top of my head. But again, right, like there's
Okay.
there's there's good resources out there. So
Yeah.
it's not like, oh, pick Jeremy's favorites because he recommended them. There's good stuff out there. I think when you're working with something like leaving a high control religion, right, finding a therapist who's trained in that, I went to my own
Mhm.
therapist when I was going through this process, and they were non-religious, and I thought that would be really great, but some things they didn't like understand or didn't relate to because they hadn't gone through it. So
Yeah.
again, just kind of like working through that process and making sure you're finding somebody who's a good fit. Um, you don't have to
Mhm.
stay with a therapist who's not a good fit. You're not hurting them. You're not harming them.
Mhm.
That's good
No.
boundaries to say this isn't a
Yeah.
good fit. This isn't for
Yeah.
me. So
Also,
yeah, I
you're
think
allowed to, yeah. Also, you're allowed to ask a therapist about what they believe or where they stand on certain things before you decide to see them. That's
right.
completely okay. If for some therapists, it might not be what they're used to, but if that's a boundary that's really important to you, that your therapist, like for you to know for sure that your therapist isn't going to push religion on you, you can ask of if that is the background that they're coming from or what to expect within therapy. That's all part of
Right.
your informed consent.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's all my big stuff. We're on Instagram
All
right now,
right.
so at Wellness with Jared,
Awesome.
people can find me there. I also have a YouTube channel that's in its infancy and is very new and
Hey,
is kind of my
what are you
creative
doing with your
outlet when
YouTube
I talk
channel?
about.
Yeah.
I talk about a lot of different stuff. So I've done a couple like show reviews. I talked about
Okay.
the Patient, which is a psychological thriller. So I gave a review on that. I talk about like some couples tips, and I talk about some stuff like trauma, but I also talk about comic books, and it's kind of like my way to talk about mental health in a fun and engaging way, not just in a like
Hey.
here's how to stop arguing, although that is one of my videos. So I keep plugging that. I have, some videos that do okay and some
Okay.
videos that have like 6 views still. So plugging my
Yeah.
YouTube channel.
Great. Yeah, that's so great. YouTube is one I would like to also invest in at some point. But good for you
Yeah.
for doing that already. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And thanks
Thanks so much.
thanks for having me on. This is my first Instagram live, so I learned a new thing today
Okay.
and it was really great.
Great. Thanks for being willing to do it and a really, really helpful conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.